Thank you. I'll begin with an apology. The title itself is an extremely broad one, and as most of you will appreciate, it was done a long while ago, and at that point the objective was to make it as broad as possible so that we can work on the paper by the time of the conference. So given that, I'll first set out what I will actually do in this paper. One of the ways in which I will focus this paper is actually I'll be looking at the Adivasi belt. And what I'm going to talk about is not simply land, displacement, and livelihoods in general, but I'm going to talk about a particular process of transformation that I see as happening in the Adivasi belt with respect to land and forests in particular. So I will be talking about land, about displacement and livelihood, and the kind of cross that the people in the Adivasi belt in particular bear today, given the kind of changes, broader changes that are happening in India. The fact that there is considerable amount of displacement and forced displacement, as well as issues such as land alienation, is something that has been talked about for a long time now, including in several other sessions. So that is in fact something that I'm going to take for granted, that there is an awareness about it. There is a severe exploitation, alienation of Adivasis. The fact that in the last 2 decades, the situation is particularly worsened. There have been a number of struggles against this kind of dispossession. There's also been significant state violence against Adivasis in all of these regions, which I think again has come up widely, at least in the sessions in this conference itself. And such violence has in fact intensified in the last 10 to 15 years. And this is state violence is in fact intensified irrespective of whether the response or the struggle has been violent or non-violent. So what I'm going to talk about is this region itself, and looking at agrarian relations in terms of Adivasi relationship to the land, how that is changing, the kind of land alienation that is happening, and as well as the kind of struggles that are forming around it. One of the things that I want to start with is the idea that land alienation and alienation of Adivasis from the natural resource base is something that has a very long history in the subcontinent. And there's been a lot of writing that shows that this has happened in the colonial period or even in the period before that. What I want to focus on is the post-independent period, and I will argue that the rate and scale of the process, particularly in the last 2 decades, has in fact intensified. But more than that, I also want to argue that the nature of the process itself and its characteristics have in fact changed in the last 20 years, really referring to the broader neoliberal changes that are happening in the country also. In understanding the nature of Adivasi economy and society, it's very easy to fall back on versions of either essentialist or romantic accounts that posit Adivasi societies often as autarkic. That is the condition of being societies that are closed economies or self-sufficient within themselves. Conditions of subsistence, however, I believe, should not be confused with autarky. So the question is not whether any particular tribal ethnic group was autarkic in the past, is not a question that I'm addressing today, but rather looking at a contemporary situation given the specific location of Adivasi relationship to land, agriculture, forests within the broader political economy of India itself and the world. So what I hope to convey to you is the idea that we are seeing a very peculiar process of accumulation by dispossession occurring in Adivasi regions of India. That is a process of extra economic accumulation, which has at least 2 components to it. The first is forced displacement from the means of production, which we will see in more detail. And the second is a privatization of common resources. And I will try to convince you that it's important that we significantly notice that these 2 processes are not independent of each other, because it's often possible to talk about displacement and struggles against it, and the idea of privatization of commons and struggles against it. This kind of accumulation by dispossession is also occurring in a situation where the Adivasi economy is forced increasingly to depend on migration. So that is a third factor that I want to bring in, that there is significant migration into the entire Adivasi belt. And state power of law and violence is the mainstay of this accumulation process. So we're talking about both law, so legal dispossession that's happening, and violence. And I want to see a relationship between the two, not as 2 separate processes. Of course, we will call this accumulation by dispossession, as David Harvey uses it, in the particular sense that it is a dispossession that occurs in fully capitalist conditions. So the proletarianization of Adivasis is sought to be completed in this process rather than begun. So that is also an argument that I will make in the course of this discussion. The concept of accumulation by dispossession used here draws from, but also shifts away from, interpretation of Marx's use of primitive accumulation as a historical precondition of capitalism, and Luxemburg's emphasis on the process of primitive accumulation to explain global expansion of capital into the periphery. So we are neither assigning Adivasi areas as the periphery nor as pre-capitalist, even though we will talk about accumulation as dispossession. So that is the linkage that I hope to convince you of in the next 15-20 minutes or so, and we can debate that in a later part. The second part of the paper, which I will do briefly also, aims to understand the particular process, nature of the process through which Adivasis have been joining the segmented labor force in India, which provides the material basis for their identity as Adivasis to emerge, rather than a pure working class identity, pure within quotes, the idea of an entirely proletarian identity that does not have other aspects to it, or an identity as members of specific or separate ethnic or clan-based groups. So I will in fact be arguing that as many others have, that Adivasi in fact is a very modern identity and not really something that relies on ethnic or earlier identities. So we will seek to understand Adivasi identities as a modern identity made possible, at least partly, by the specific nature of capitalist relations in these regions. So I'll begin with all the parts that I said so far. First of all, to look at displacement itself. One of the most noticeable, or at least it should be noticeable, although the mainstream tries to ignore it, is the fact of forcible displacement of people from their lands and livelihood. So we're talking about displacement induced supposedly by what is called development, so development-induced displacement for things like dams, for national parks and sanctuaries, for mining and these kinds of processes, where often the displacement has in fact been forced and violent, not just is forced and violent. Well, this is happening extensively all over the world in the name of development conservation. If you look at the literature, there are reports from almost all over the world of things like green grabs, whether it's Africa or Latin America. I think it has its scale and implications within India for Adivasi societies is particularly severe. Again, this is not discounting that is happening in other rural regions and agrarian societies, which are non-Adivasis, but I think the impact it is having on the very, not just on Adivasi livelihood, but their very basis of existence and cultural existence is quite severe. For instance, although Adivasis or STs, as the surveys talk about, constitute only 8% of the population, they are estimated to be more than 40% of people displaced by so-called development projects in independent India. Although there's very little or almost no official data on the number of people displaced, this is data that has been available for a while now from a number of writers and activists, and I think particularly Walter Fernandez is someone who's been compiling various small studies to bring out such estimates. And one of the things that his work and the work of many others in fact shows that the proportion of proportion of Adivasis among people who are displaced in India is as high as 40%. And given that their proportion is, is only 8% in the population of India. The rest, of course, as you would, as you can guess, is comprised of Dalits and the rural poor. While the state has not, thought it significant to maintain such data, it is estimated that 50 to 60 million people in India today are considered as displaced persons, or people deprived of access to land and common livelihoods. This displacement of 60 million people has actually occurred after independence, so we're talking of the period from 1950 to 2000, and the estimates are that they've been displaced from about 25 million hectares of land, including about 7 million hectares of forests and 6 million hectares of common property resources, often revenue, grazing land, these kinds of lands. But even these national averages that I give you actually underestimate the impact that displacement has on tribals or Adivasis, because a vast majority of this displacement has also occurred only in the regions that are actually considered the Adivasi belt or the tribal belt also. I'm making the distinction where the preferred term among a majority of the people in the states that are called the Northeast is actually tribal, so I'm talking about the rest of the ST population in the country. Walter Fernandez, okay, again, so there's a lot of statistics around. I'm going to skip some of that part. We can come back to that in discussion if you're interested. You can actually look at states like Jharkhand, which have 3 million displaced simply in a 20-year period, in a 25-year period, the last 25 years. 3 million in a state like Odisha, 5 million in a state like Andhra Pradesh. So what we're talking about is while you have a national average, most of the displacement has actually also happened in a particular belt in India. So that is with regard to displacement, that it is a significant character affecting how Adivasis survive today. The second aspect that I want to add to this is the idea that the Adivasi livelihood today is actually dependent on migration. I'm not talking about the reasons here. There's a lot of argument of how they've been pushed into it rather than it happening as a choice, which I agree with, but that is not what I'm focusing on here. So while the cultivator identity remains significant and Adivasi relationship to land remains significant in a cultural, political, social, and economic sense also, it is crucial to note that the rate of migration in scheduled ST households is actually higher than the rate for other groups in rural India. This is again the last NSSO figures show this. Similarly, again from NSSO figures, we can actually look at the area owned per tribal household, and the number given is 1.1 hectares. And we just heard what amount of land is required for a household to be completely dependent on agriculture and land. This, of course, is a partial view because Adivasi economy has always depended not just on legally owned land, but also lands that are often owned through de facto used by them, as well as on forest and common property resources. But I'll come to in the next section to what is happening to that aspect of it. So one of the things that I want to point out is that the fact of migration, and particularly seasonal migration, and migration, particularly in the lean agricultural period, is in fact, has been a pattern of livelihood in many Adivasi villages, again, especially in the central Indian states. Short period migration can be even up to 80% in villages in particularly Schedule 5 districts in states like Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, and Madhya Pradesh, which I've looked at. Again, another aspect of this migration is a significant percent. In fact, one study, which is a survey in Jharkhand, actually shows that 85% of migrants are actually under the age of 35. So all of this has impact on the economy itself and how we imagine Adivasi, and also an influence on how we imagine Adivasi struggles. So I'll come back to these issues later. Another aspect of migration that is not adequately covered often by these large-scale statistics is the migration of women as workers from Schedule 5 areas. There is little separation available in the data, in the secondary data, particularly between migration for work and marriage-related migration, which also often involves work. So surveys done at the receiving end, for instance in places like Delhi, show us that there are specific patterns of integration of Adivasi women migrants into the labor force in urban India. For instance, one of the things that there is writing about is the fact that full-time domestic labor in cities like Delhi or Bombay or Mumbai is actually predominantly taken up by Adivasi women. So in some sense, what I'm also trying to establish here that Adivasi proletarization is not in fact a new phenomenon, but the degree to which they're dependent on wage labor has increased substantially in recent times. We're talking about 80% of the households actually depending on wage labor for long periods of time during the year. While cultivating land remains crucial for subsistence, for self-identity, cultural and political security, its proportionate role in Adivasi economy has changed substantially. Given current tenurial conditions, the sustainability, both ecological and socio-economic, of the agrarian basis of Adivasi economy needs to be carefully examined, rather than assumed. The third aspect of transformation that's happening in this region that I want to add to these two aspects is the idea of land alienation that's occurring in particular ways in the neoliberal period in the last 20 years, particularly the privatization of common property resources, which in fact we can connect to the conditions for capital which are created through the legal process, not just the violent and the extra-legal processes that the state use for dispossession. In fact, one of the examples that I would take to make this argument is to talk about forests, without which I think it is futile to talk about the Indian Adivasi political economy at all. The proportion of common property resources, what is classified officially as common property resources, is much higher than in the Schedule 5 areas than it is, and in Adivasi-dominated states, than it is in the rest of India. So as such, there is data that shows that in these particular districts where Adivasis are in a majority or in Schedule 5 areas, the amount of land classified as common property is actually much higher than other states in India. And there is also a lot of writing that shows how in the colonial and also the immediately post-independence period, and the forest policies and the forest settlement process, in fact, resulted in state takeover of vast tracts of forests and grazing land as state property. So the whole regime of reserved forests and protected forests and other state forests is actually seen as a process of alienation of Adivasi land. While land was forcibly and often illegally made reserved or protected forests on records, the movement of the land was relatively retarded, also because of significant ground-level protests, but also because the level of investment and the entry of capital into these regions were fairly low up to the recent times. So while the process of Adivasi land alienation has a long history, there are dramatic changes in land and forest tenures in the current phase of neoliberal state policy. And the one example that I would like to take is in fact an example that is often thought of as being something that provides rights to Adivasis, which is really the Forest Rights Act of 2007. The Forest Rights Act, of course, is rightfully praised for the fact that it does give rights to certain amounts of land to Adivasis. But if you look at one of the things that has happened with implementation, what the Forest Rights Act has really achieved in implementation is regularizing some of the forest use in terms of, individual pattas to individual residents of the region. Again, even that has happened only in regions where there is struggle and where there is organized protest to do that kind of thing. And there are significant protests in other regions where FRA is not being implemented in order to have it implemented. So I'm beginning with the idea that it's very, very significant. It's important to even have a law like this, given the crisis that is there in this region. But having said that, I want to look at the impact of FRA from the perspective of what is happening to land and forest tenure in a broad sense. What I find is that FRA's most significant contribution, in fact, has been towards recording private property. There is enough statistics available on this. The FRA does have several elements to it. One is the recognition of individual pattas to people who have already been cultivating the land. And there's another section which talks about how the land can also be registered as community land. And if you look at the implementation in all these years, one of the things that you find is that the implementation is focused almost exclusively on providing private land pattas rather than on the other. So what it has achieved so far, at least I will argue, is really been towards recording private property and reclassifying common lands as either private or state property. So one of the things it is achieving is actually regularizing or establishing clear property rights. And this, of course, becomes important because it's worth looking at the demands of capital as expressed in things like the World Bank report on what needs to be done in order to attract investment in so-called backward areas of India. One of the requirements identified clearly is clear tenurial regimes. So the need to have clarity about who owns the land is more significant in order to attract investment, is what the World Bank advises and what the FRA also moves towards going. So apart from the land that is given as, that is recognized as individual, apart from the forest land for which individual pattas are given on the basis that they have been cultivated for a long period of time, we really do not have any other recognition in terms of rights. The rest of the land becomes identified as state forests. This is also significant because there has been a long history of struggle in this entire region, delegitimizing the very process of forest settlement. So if you look at an earlier era of Adivasi struggles, there have been arguments in places like Jharkhand saying that the first wave with the Indian Forest Act was actually an illegal takeover of what was initially Adivasi used forests by the state. So that delegitimizing the Indian Forest Act is something that is taken away with the coming of the Forest Rights Act. And in fact, one of the things that we need to ask is why FRA was acceptable and was implemented, whereas in earlier, the PISA, the Panchayati Extension to Scheduled Areas Act, which also gave the same rights to forests to Adivasis, was not implemented in states like Jharkhand. There was no move to implement it at all. PISA, with all its faults, still differs from FRA in one crucial aspect. It seeks to provide autonomy to govern natural resources to Adivasis, and the settlement powers are devolved to a certain extent to the Gram Sabha. So one of the things I'm trying to argue here is that there is a discursive shift that the FRA achieves, which is significant. It actually successfully makes the shift from a discourse of autonomy of Adivasis to the language of rights. Okay, there's 3-4 minutes. Yeah, okay, so this is as far as looking at the transformations that are happening, particularly in the last 20 years in the Central Indian Adivasi belt. The other aspect that I think needs to be seen in conjunction with this transformation that's happening with land tenure and forest and agriculture is in fact how Adivasis are getting integrated into the larger Indian labor markets, and particularly a labor market that has been recognized as being segmented. So in some sense, if we understand the experiences of displaced Adivasis in the labor market, people who have been either displaced or who have migrated or we are being pushed and pulled by various forces to actually go in for wage labor, here also the picture is fairly clear. They remain segregated to specific sectors that have the worst and most demeaning conditions of work and face both economic exploitation but also race, ethnicity related based discrimination or oppression. So this is something that's fairly well established by a number of studies that are done looking at Adivasi migrants in urban centers in India. The segmented nature, of course, is well known. So one of the things that becomes important then is looking at the fact that Adivasis who enter the workforce as Adivasis often remain Adivasis even though they may be part of the proletariat. So it's not only an economic classification, but in terms of identity, it retains, there is a material basis for the retention of that identity. Opportunities for work, security, risk, and risk insurance, housing, cultural community, residence, community activities as migrants, all of these remain restricted on the basis of an Adivasi identity within the workforce, even in urban areas. One of the things that, one of the reasons I'm saying this is also to recognize Adivasi as a very modern identity, which is very different from earlier clan-based identities, clan-based or ethnic identities. So earlier, although we do talk of Adivasi movements, what we're referring to is a Munda rebellion or a Santal rebellion and things like that. And the idea of Adivasis as one group, given all the heterogeneity amongst the various groups, is really a fairly modern, modern term, and it has particular significance for the way struggles are organized. And in one sense, the idea of migration and all of these processes also contribute to the formation of this kind of modern identity. Okay, I'll conclude. I'll just take a minute, yeah. So in one sense, what I want to conclude with is to look at all of these different things that I've laid out in conjunction with each other rather than as separate processes. Right? And many of these processes, in fact, can be applied perhaps in various ways to the broader agrarian transformation that's happening in India. But to understand the nature and the revolutionary potential of struggles that are discursively situated as struggles against dispossession, rather than direct economic exploitation of capitalism. So this, in fact, is where I think this kind of analysis would help us come to, that we can actually start looking at the potential of struggles that are often thought of as new social movements or identity movements, and are often clearly, there is a distinction, but are also particularly seen as not being movements against direct economic exploitation that comes in a capitalist economy. So moving away from the dichotomy of working class protest versus the Jal Jangal Zameen protests, in fact, may allow us to see the specific nature of neoliberal capitalism as it exists in India today, and the material linkages that actually exist between these two forms of struggles. So in the global debate on primitive accumulation, accumulation by dispossession, accumulation by extra economic means in conditions of neoliberal and advanced capitalism, these are all the various terms that have been used to describe similar processes across the world. The question of possible or potential links between progressive struggles is in fact one that's particularly significant, has been significant and is significant for us. One of the hesitations some of the left have often had regarding what are termed as new social movements or identity movements in this particular sense emerges from the understandings that struggles over dispossessions need not always be progressive within quotes in a historical or a historical materialist sense, even when they are anti-capitalist. So you might recognize them as anti-capitalist struggles, but not necessarily as progressive in that particular Marxist sense. I want to clarify, I'm sorry, I will take a little bit more. I want to, because I want to throw something to discussion. I want to clarify my own position here and emphasize that every struggle against exploitation and oppression is valuable and needs to be supported and strengthened. So when we're talking about progressive here, we're not necessarily devaluing any struggle in that sense. And they need to be supported and strengthened for many, many other reasons that I will not elaborate here, whether or not we see a historical revolutionary potential in it. However, we also see elements of revivalism or a romanticization or an imagination that assumes that societies or even ecologies can actually go back to prior states. We do find this in a lot of social movements in India too. So there is an idea that it's possible to go back to past golden ages in at least some of the environmental and livelihood struggles that are now part of the new social movements. We also find elements that fail to recognize the absolute integration of this form of accumulation that I argue can no longer be thought of as primitive accumulation in a historical stage sense of the term into neoliberal capitalism. However, by not recognizing the material linkages between the two, that is between the accumulation by dispossession and struggles around that, and struggles that are happening in what is thought of as working class struggles or advanced capitalism, we seriously jeopardize our ability to attack the neoliberal form of capitalism. I'm going to end by quoting Harvey here, David Harvey here. He argues that the two forms of struggle, that is, progressive struggles over accumulation by dispossession, perhaps not all of them, but definitely some of them, and struggles over expanded reproduction are organically linked within the historical geography of capitalism. And so in neglecting one or the other, the left disempowers itself and limits both its analytical and its programmatic powers. So I'll end with that by saying that this applies so profoundly, in fact, to the condition of Adivasis and Adivasi struggles in contemporary India.